Tough, courageous, charismatic, heroic, greatness. That's what it takes to become a racing legend. On NASCAR's great drivers, past, present, and future, we'll ride shotgun with the best drivers in stock car racing. We'll meet the toughest men ever to get behind the wheel, like the Intimidator Dale Earnhardt and his kindred spirit from 30 years ago, the take-no-prisoners Lee Petty.
He was one of the guys that kind of came along that was rough and tumble and would borrow your car and flip it in a race and then say thanks for the ride and leave you hanging there with your wrecked car. If people think Earnhardt's rough, I don't think he was in the same league with Lee Petty.
The hard-driving Curtis Turner and the moonshiner Junior Johnson, who drove one way, win or wreck. And the other greats like David Pearson, the Silver Fox, and Ned Jarrett, smooth on the racetrack. The charismatic Darrell Waltrip, and of course, the king, Richard Petty.
Richard Petty probably is this sport's consummate all-time professional in all facets of the sport. Sure, there may have been better pure drivers, but there have never been better pure ambassadors to the sport or better people in the sport.
We'll find out what drove these men to wrestle a stock car deep in the corner of a racetrack and how their accomplishments earned them their place in history. And we'll meet the drivers battling to become legends, like Jeff Gordon, Wonder Kid of the 90s. Join Dr. Jerry Bunch for a high-speed ride on NASCAR's great drivers, past, present, and future. And keep an eye out for our other great racing tapes, like the thrill-filled Legendary Tracks Unforgettable Moments and the profile of champion Jeff Gordon in Triumph of a Dream, all from Sony Music Video.
Man, I get chills just looking at these old cars. Hello everyone, I'm Benny Parsons, 1973 Winston Cup champion. And I'm glad you could join us on NASCAR's greatest moments, the early years. And what better place to bring you this tape than from right here, the Joe Weatherly Museum in Darlington, South Carolina, right next to the historic Darlington International Raceway. This is a place where the men and machines that have made NASCAR history have been honored. So you're going to meet those men and relive the most amazing, heart-stopping, and well, greatest moments from the early days of racing. The story begins in the hills of North Carolina in the 1940s. Moonshiners, hellraisers, and generally men who like to drive fast battle for bragging rights of who was the best and baddest driver around.
The stories go that many times when drivers went to a race, now this would be on a dirt track or maybe a short asphalt track, most of them would have been dirt track races, and expecting to get paid a certain amount of money. And the stories go that the promoter many times would hang the green flag out and leave with the money. And they'd race until they finally figured out, hey, this race isn't going to end, and if it does, we aren't going to get paid. And so that was what Bill France wanted to set up an organization that the drivers would be guaranteed a certain amount of money, whatever that amount of money was, that they would be guaranteed that they'd get that money after the race. And I think that was one of the key motivations in forming NASCAR. And I think it's been a godsend over the years that it happened that way.
It would take an extraordinary person to put all together. Enter Big Bill France, a man who would forever change the face of motorsports in America.
When Bill France walked into a room, it lit up. I mean, he was a guy that you just knew that he was a leader. When you first met him, or if he came into a crowd, I mean, you knew that he was going to be a leader. And it seemed that most people that he met realized that, and they were willing to follow him, do whatever he wanted to do. And he had such a great mind, a great vision about what this sport should be, where it could go. And when those people would follow him and help him to accomplish the goals that he had set for himself, well, then it started moving forward. But it took someone like him, and I think there would have just been a very few people in the world that could have done what Bill France Sr. did with auto racing. It took a very special type of an individual, and he was very special.
He was the one that put it all together. You know, he didn't do it by himself. He had a lot of help, but he was the one that had the idea and then got out and got somebody else to do the work or whatever it was. So he's the one that put it all together, and the reason that we're here, you know, is because of him. I guess maybe if it hadn't been him, it'd have been somebody else, but he was the man that done it all.
Without his foresight or imagination, whatever you want to call it, none of this would ever come to pass. That's the basic reason. But he was just a unique person along with that. He was one of a kind. You never see very many of his type of people in your lifetime.
When you talk about greatest moments, you have to include this one. The time, December 14th, 1947. The place, the Streamline Hotel in Daytona Beach, Florida. Daytona was the site of not only early stock car races, but the hard-packed stands were used for setting motorcycle and automobile land speed world records. That night, France, he was a promoter as well as a sometimes driver, pulls together 35 of the key men involved in racing, drivers, rival promoters, and other key members of the sport. Now going in, not everyone shares France's vision, particularly some of the rival promoters. But France knows that the key to the sport is creating a standard set of rules, with each race another step towards crowning a national champion. By the time the smoke had cleared, France had succeeded. He was elected president. Red vote came up with the name, the National Association of Stock Car Auto Racing. And other notables of the day were also assigned key roles. E.G. Cannonball Baker of Indianapolis was named National Commissioner. Eddie Bland of Jacksonville, Florida was named Vice President. And top driver Marshall Teague was named Treasurer.
Like any game, you have to know what the rules are before you can play. Know what you can do, what you can't do. What tactics are allowed on the track, what you can do in the garage here, what you can do back in your shop. As far as modifying the equipment that's done. Most of the original changes that were allowed on the cars were for purely safety reasons, not speed, because speed does not make a race. Competition is what makes a race, and if you get all the cars even, then you have competition, then you have good racing.
The meeting that resulted in the birth of NASCAR has to be one of the greatest moments in the sport. But setting the rules and announcing a name was only the first hurdle to launch the sport. Now originally, the idea of NASCAR was to offer 3 divisions. With strictly stock cars, now that's the same as driven off the showroom floor, only one of them. And because of the shortage of cars from World War II's backlog, they never took the green flag during the first couple of years of sanctioned racing. But in 1949, rival promoters who were not at the 1947 meeting decided to stage a strictly stock race of their own, and France had to move quickly. After a couple of experimental races, France beat his rival to the punch by staging the race on June 19, 1949, a 150-miler on a 3/4-mile dirt track that looked like this one. 33 cars started, including the likes of the flamboyant Tim Flock. More about him later. And the hard-driving and hard-living Curtis Turner, and Lee Petty, a legend in his own right, not to mention the father of a certain Richard Petty, who a couple of decades later would launch his unmatched career. The cars in that first race were virtually identical to street cars, and that concept of racing with cars that fans could relate to became the foundation of the sport. And it got off to a fast start with over 13,000 spectators paying to see what would be history in the making. Glenn Dunaway from Gastonia crossed the line first, but he was disqualified for modifications he made to the suspension, and Jim Roper was given the victory. Now, how Roper came to be at the event in the first place, that's quite a NASCAR moment. He read about the race in a comic strip written by Zach Mosley, who was an auto racing fanatic. Roper drove his Lincoln to the track and drove himself into history. And now for our next great moment in early NASCAR history, we bring you the Flock family. In those days, virtually all drivers were daredevils, but these 9 brothers and sisters, they took it literally. Little sister Rio was a skydiver back in the 40s. That was way before the sport was fashionable or safe. Carl raced high-speed boats, and brothers Tim, Bob, Bonnie, and their sister Ethel were all NASCAR racers. In the 1950s, Tim was the man, winning 2 championships and 40 victories, many of which came in a car like this, the famed Hudson Hornet. Along with winning, Tim loved headlines, and one of the ways he got it was with a very interesting co-pilot, Jocko Flacco.
Ted Cheshire, who owned the Hudson Hornet, came up to me one day at the car lot in Atlanta and said, "Tim, I've got a real cute African monkey. Would you let him ride in the race car with you?" I said, "Ted, have you lost your mind?" I said, "I don't believe NASCAR let us do that." But he said, "Would you let him ride?" I said, "Well, you don't own the car. I'll let him ride." But he said, "First, I'm going to get him a little cloth helmet built and a uniform, put Jocko on it, put some decals on it," and which he did. A seamstress made 2 little uniforms for him. So we was worried about NASCAR catching this monkey in this car. We run full seats back then, like you got in your passenger car today. So a upholstery shop in Atlanta built a perch where Jocko had 2 nylon belts. He could look out the window of the car. So we parked the car in the infield and waited until they was just fixing to start. Gentlemen, start your engine. We pulled in line, and NASCAR didn't know this monkey was in the car. And Benny, when they dropped that green flag, and I'm going down in the Hudson Hornet, which I was winning racing in, when I'd pass a car, here's this driver looking over, and this monkey grinning at him. They'd almost run into the wall, really. Now he running 8 races with me, and we was running on a mile track in Raleigh on the 8th race. We had a board on a floorboard in our car with a chain. We could pull that board and had a light. We could see the right front tire, and when a white streak come that tire, you had to come in and change it with about 2 laps. So you'd worn the tire into the cord. Wore the tire down to the cord and give you 2 laps to come in. But he had watched me pull that cord. He got out from under both belts and went down, and this is a true story, went down and a pebble hit him on the head, and he come and got on my back. Here I'm running 85, 90 mile an hour and leading the race. The front is running second, and Speedy Thompson's third. So I come down pit road, and real slow and easy, I hand him to a pit crew, and I caught 2nd gear, but Funny come by and Speedy. That monkey cost me $750 difference. But stopping, which has never been done before, in NASCAR history, made a pit stop to put a monkey out of your race car.
Well, NASCAR must have known it after the second or third race.
They didn't say a word, but you can't do nothing like that anymore. You know, when Earnhardt and Waltrip was getting booed 3 or 4 years ago, I told both of them, hey, all y'all got to do is get you a monkey, but you can't ride nothing in a race car anymore. But I was the most popular guy you ever seen. Everybody in the grandstand had to come down to see Jocko.
See this monkey?
Yeah. I had to fire him after the 8th race. I could never teach him to sign his autograph.
Couldn't you? Well, you have to be a little bananas to drive a race car, I guess. But our next great moment was more than a headline-grabbing stunt. While Bill Francis' efforts to pull the sport together legitimized things, he knew he needed something big to elevate NASCAR to the next level. It was a time for NASCAR to go big time, and France looked for a paved superspeedway to hold a 500-mile race, which led him to Darlington. France joined forces with Harold Brazenton, who built a 1.25 mile track in 1950, and to this day, it's an egg-shaped track. You see, Brazenton didn't want to dig up his favorite fishing hole, so he made one end of the track smaller than the other, creating a racing surface that quickly earned some telling nicknames like Track Too Tough to Tame and the Lady in Black. Now worse, being close to the seashore, sand became entrenched in the surface, making the track slippery.
We were running a 1/4 mile track in Richmond back in those days, and we heard about them building this big super speedway. So we loaded up and went down there and looked at it, and I'm telling you, anything that big didn't need to be raced on. That'd take you across the country.
You know, I went to Darlington as a kid and crawled under the fence. Didn't have money to get in, and went to crawl under the fence to get inside. And I was just fascinated by it. And Darlington being the first super speedway, and I was just fascinated.
Qualifying for this race was an extraordinary affair, which actually took 15 days to complete, and all the big guns of the day were there, from the friendly Lee Petty to Fireball Roberts, and of course Tim Flock. On the pole with the fastest time of 83.034 miles per hour was the legendary Curtis Turner, the series point leader at the time. And now what makes this moment so unusual is that racing on this paved surface was a first for all these drivers. They had grown up racing on dirt, sliding four wheels through the corners and putting them pedal to the metal.
When we got there, we were sent up the road to have the cars inspected, and then we came back to the track, and in warm-ups and in the race, everybody ran right on the bottom. I mean, nobody went up to the top but one car.
One driver took a different approach. His name was Johnny Mance from Long Beach, California, and he took his time qualifying, locking in his starting spot 43rd back in the pack, almost 10 miles per hour slower than Turner. But he had a plan. It was based on his experience from driving the AAA IndyCar circuit, and going fast was not part of that plan.
Johnny Mance had run Indy, so he had about a feel for what he needed to do to run a 500-mile race. So he was very careful and consistent, had the right equipment. He didn't have any real racing engines, but he was smart enough to take the stock engine and give it the type of clearance that it needed to be consistent and stay together. When you look back then and look at what they did to be able to run 500 miles, he had the right answer, and he won the race.
Like everything else on the cars, the tires were stock. And when Mance suggested to the other drivers they use a harder compound like he had at Indianapolis, they didn't pay attention. Well, at the onset, the big names battled for the lead, with Turner leading 22 of the early laps. He met the wrath of the lady in black when he flipped on lap 275 and eventually finished 60th. Others fell out as the tire problem got worse. Now the story goes that the drivers had to take tires off their own cars just to finish the race. I always wondered, how'd those guys get home?
I've heard stories that the drivers would run out of tires that they took with them and would go out in the infield and take tires off of their personal cars or somebody else's personal cars or whatever just to continue running. And back then there were big varieties of street tires, and even the tire manufacturers thought that their special type street tires, not your everyday type tire, but it was a little high performance, I guess. They thought that there would be no problem running 500 miles on those tires. They thought their tires were good enough, but they had no idea what kind of strain would be on the tires, how much heat they would build up, and that kind of thing, because they had never experienced anything like that.
I had taken a couple of the asphalt tires we were using on the short track in Richmond, and I said, well, we'll save those tires for the last run. So we put them on the car, and one of them blew going down pit road, so we never got to run them. You know, they wouldn't stand the type of speed that you had then. But it was a lot of tire trouble. There was a lot of every kind of trouble there.
Well, as tires were blown, Mance just kept plodding along, conserving his tires. He virtually went from last to first by lap 50 and cruised to victory with a 9-lap lead over second place Fireball Robert with an average speed of 75.250 miles per hour. He took home $10,510, the biggest payday of its time. And speaking of time, people complain about races today taking too long. Mance cruised to victory in just over 6 hours and 38 minutes. Man, he earned his money. A lot has changed, but you know what? That track is still as tough as ever. In 1984, I qualified on the pole and wrecked on the first lap. And I'm not alone in having a healthy respect for Darlington.
Darlington's just the corners are tough to get around. It's narrow, it's real fast. Only takes a few laps. The tires give up because of the surface, and it just makes it where it's slippery. So that makes it real tough.
Now, while NASCAR racing on paved tracks and dirt tracks kept growing, racing was still going full speed ahead on the fabled beach course in Daytona. And man, those days were crazy.
Well, you could compare it to a family today getting ready to go to California to the amusement park or something. It was a lot of excitement, whoever heard of going down and running a Daytona Beach or on a beach anyway, and to go down there and run a couple of miles on a little 2-lane asphalt road and then get out on a big wide beach, and it just amazed you on how those guys could come down a little 2-lane highway. It was very bumpy. It had a lot of kind of hills and valleys in it, and drop down into where you had to make that left turn onto the beach, and there they would slide that car into that corner. And how they did it, I don't know. I ran down the beach wide open, but I never ran through a corner or tried to brake to get through that corner at the speed that they were doing. And again, as an observer, I don't know how they did it.
They drove cars north on the beach, south on A1A, and back on the sands again, with the start of the race dictated by the tide. Now, while all that was okay, Big Bill France had a bigger dream. One of the great moments was February 1958, as a crowd of 35,000, imagine that, 35,000 people in Daytona watching them race on the sand. They witnessed Paul Goldsmith battle Curtis Turner. Turner was driving a Pontiac built by the legendary mechanic Smokey Yunick. Goldsmith would go to victory lane on the beach course's last hurrah. When the sand had settled, France unveiled his plans to build the biggest, fastest, most competitive track in history. It would become the new 2.5-mile Daytona International Speedway. The opening of this track in 1959 catapulted stock car racing into a whole new level. Daytona's treacherous 31-degree high banks combined with its enormous straightaways posed a huge challenge for drivers used to conquering small bull rings carved from cornfields. It was the first high bank oval any of these country boys had ever seen. Imagine what it must have felt like to have walked through the tunnel and seen that place for the first time.
I couldn't believe how big it was. I mean, it was bigger than all the rest of the racetracks we run put together. And at that time, there was nothing in the infield, just a few grandstands and stuff, and it made it look even bigger than it does today. So first time we seen it, we came through the tunnel, and you just popped out into the infield, and there it was, just as far as you could see was racetrack. So, it was just a completely different deal. I had just started racing. I'd been racing probably 6 months, and, from that standpoint, it didn't make a whole lot of difference to me. I wasn't used to anyone, whether it was a short track or a big track, didn't make a whole lot of difference.
I was at Daytona in 1959 as a spectator, and that was the most awesome thing that I had ever seen in my life. And I couldn't figure it out how a car could just come off of the corner and just blow by somebody else with that much speed, and then the next lap, that driver would do him the same way. Had no idea what was going on as far as drafting was concerned. I just thought, well, he just mashed the pedal and took off, and then he got scared when he got out front and backed off, and the other guy passed him back. But we learned, as the time went by, that what was happening, they were drafting and building up that momentum and just blowing right on by. But it was awesome.
All the greats were there. Fireball Roberts, series champion Lee Petty, and a hard-charging newcomer, Junior Johnson.
It didn't take them long to find out how to get around that big track. And in a year or so, it was like they'd been running there all their life.
Now, the most amazing thing about the first race at Daytona, and fans are going to find this hard to believe, is that despite the fact this was the first time any of these drivers had raced on a super speedway, there was not a single wreck or caution all day long. Man, is that incredible? 59 drivers battled for nearly 4 hours, racing at an average speed of 135.521. But don't think that doesn't mean the racing wasn't fierce and competitive right down to the wire. The lead changed hands 35 times that day until 2 cars sprinted for the finish. Now, the second most amazing moment from this first race, it was a photo finish between Johnny Beauchamp and Lee Petty. The third car in the shot is Joe Weatherly, and he's 2 laps down. Well, the officials at the finish line declared Beauchamp the winner. Lee Petty protested to anyone who would listen, and he didn't leave town. Well, 2 days later, the local paper printed this photo. And with that evidence, Bill France changed the decision, and the trophy was given to Petty.
Johnny Beauchamp, he and I were running on the last lap. And going out of the third turn, up fourth turn there, he went high and I went low. I went across the finish line, and somebody said, well, how'd you know you won the race? I said, I looked out the window and I had to look back when I went across the finish line.
And Weatherly was a lap down, and he was in the bunch with 3 of us. I'm sure there's been 1,000, 10,000 pictures out of that finish. And he was trying to help Lee win the race because he was NASCAR and boat champ, was kind of a foreigner. And Lee said sometimes he was trying to help, but at other times he was getting in the way. So I don't know. It turned out that we won the race, but they first give it to boat champ, and then there were so many amateur photographers that sent film in that they finally give us the race.
Felt real good. Felt real good. In fact, felt so good back then they didn't make much money. I got $11,000 for winning the 500 race. Now that's something, ain't it?
Now, Lee Petty's victories and championships have secured his place in history, but just about as well known for his take no prisoners attitude. Basically, he would do whatever it took to win a race, and I mean whatever, which leads us to our next moment. It was 1959, and there was a race at Lakewood Speedway near Atlanta, Georgia. Well, when the checkered flag dropped, Lee's son, future legend Richard Petty, pulled into victory lane for his first victory with Lee in second. However, when Lee showed up in victory lane, it wasn't to congratulate his son, it was to protest the win, claiming the laps had been counted wrong and he was the winner. He demanded the scorecards be recounted. Well, now what really happened is forever lost in the Georgia night, but Lee was adamant. Plus, if he was awarded the victory, there was a bonus that Richard wasn't eligible for. So the Petty family stood to make more money with Lee as the victor. In any event, on further review, Lee was awarded the win, snatching victory from his son. To Lee, everyone was the competition. Now, Richard the King, he took winning just as seriously, just differently. Now, that's the way it was and is. Now, we've already seen how Daytona has been the backdrop for many of the sport's greatest moments, and there's more on tap, particularly in the second volume of this video series, NASCAR's Greatest Moments, the Modern Era. But still, one of my favorite NASCAR moments that took place in Daytona happened in 1963. During Speed Weeks, that 2-week period filled with qualifying and all kinds of racing, there was an event where near tragedy became the backdrop for opportunity and one of the sweetest victories in the history of all motorsports. That year, driver Marvin Panch went to Daytona with hopes of driving the famed Wood Brothers Ford to victory lane. Even back then, the February race in Daytona was the biggest and most prestigious event in the sport. And like today, it's the race every driver dreams of winning. Unfortunately for Panch, while driving a Maserati Birdcage during an endurance race, an event is similar to today's 24 Hours of Daytona, he crashed horribly and was trapped underneath the burning car. While firemen raced to the rescue to put out the flames, it was fellow race car driver named Tiny Lund who saved his life. Tiny was sort of named for his size. He stood 6'5" and weighed around 270 pounds. He literally lifted the car to pull Panch out.
Well, how it all started, Briggs Cunningham, who had these Birdcage Maserati, been running 24 hours over in Europe and all over, wanted to play with one of our Winston car Grand National engines in this car to give it more horsepower. So he's looking for a dummy to try it out, see how it worked, and naturally I had a volunteer. I was young and eager. So went out and practiced, came back in, wasn't feeling too good, and Leonard Wood, who worked on my Wood Brothers car, made a couple little changes on the car, and we fueled it, and he said, be careful with it. And the first thing, I took a couple laps, and the first time I stood on it down the backstretch, the sucker got airborne. It came up, flipped over, and came on stop, and it slid into 3 and landed over by the tunnel there in Daytona, upside down. Even when it went up and came down on its top, skating along, I grabbed the wheel and pulled away as far as I could, and the heat from rubbing, didn't have much room in there. On the pavement, it was starting to burn me already before I even got stopped. It just kind of wore it right on through. Well, yeah, I was very much aware of it. And then when I spotted that fire and wanted the guy to get it out, because I couldn't get out, I tried my doggone it. I kicked and frammed. They said you should be able to kick it open, but you couldn't kick that one open. So I was glad to see these guys.
Now, Lund was a driver, but he didn't have a ride and had come to Daytona hoping against long odds to land one. Well, as Panch lay in his hospital bed, he suggested to his car owners, the Wood Brothers, that since he couldn't drive, that Lund get the ride. Incredibly, Lund would hold off Fred Lorenzen and Ned Jarrett, getting his just rewards for saving Panch's life. He went on to win the first Grand National race of his life, the most prestigious event in motorsports, the Daytona 500. Man, talk about drama. He coasted across the finish line out of gas.
That was a real fairy tale type of a situation. Tiny Lund, you know, he was loved by everybody, just a big baby, I guess, in one sense. He was a good race driver, but he was a fun-loving type of a guy and would give you the shirt off his back. And it was not surprising at all that he went to help Marvin Panch. And then I guess it was not surprising either, after he did that, that the Wood brothers would choose him to replace Marvin in their Ford for the Daytona 500. And it was a tremendous race. Lorenzen ran out of gas. He had to pit for gas. He knew that he was going to with 8 laps to go, and I thought I had enough gas to finish the race. We had the way we had calculated, and I thought as much drafting as I had done that I was okay. But then with 2 laps to go, I ran out of gas, and I was still in the lead. And of course, Tiny, he was there with me then, and he went on to win the race.
The Wood brothers, Leonard and Glenn, have popped up in a variety of our greatest moments already. But this next one is about them specifically and how they changed the face of NASCAR racing and made headlines by taking their unique pit skills to Indianapolis, a truly unique moment. Now, the Wood brothers are classic NASCAR boys. Having grown up near the North Carolina and Virginia border, they worked the sawmill as boys, but only as a way to support their true love, racing. Glenn started out as a driver and battled against the best, including the famous Flocks, Curtis, Turner, Lee Petty, and the rest of the gang. Leonard was the crew chief. Eventually, Glenn retired from behind the wheel and became a car owner with Leonard as his crew chief. Now, along with winning races on the track, the two pioneered pit stops, realizing you could pick up time on the track by getting out of the pits faster. They came up with a concept of assigning each man a particular task and having each job done at the same time. Their plan worked, and before long, all the competitors found out you could win a race by your speed in the pits as well as on the track. However, while NASCAR racers picked up this pit strategy pretty quick, the folks over at the famed Indianapolis Motor Speedway were still doing things the slow, old-fashioned way. Until one day, Leonard Wood got a strange call from world champion Jim Clark. Clark and his team were looking for an edge at the upcoming 1965 Indy 500. Before long, the Wood brothers were packing their bags to spend a Memorial Day afternoon at the Indianapolis Speedway.
Ford wanted us to come up and pit Jim Clark, and we came into this English garage, and we were supposed to take his car over just and make a pit stop, but they didn't seem to resent it at all. It would have been much harder to do if they hadn't, but they just seemed to welcome us to come in, and they let us do anything we wanted to in preparations to make to prepare for a pit stop, you know.
But you didn't change tires. Did that car run all day with no tire change?
We didn't have to change tires, but we was prepared to. We'd fitted all the dial pins and the wheels, you know, to fit on smoothly, and we had my brother Ray checking the tires for depth, you know, the wear depth every time, you know, and if it had been a wear problem, we would have certainly changed.
Well, it worked. Clark used his edge in the pits to go on and take the checkered flag that day. And to this day, using the pits as a key component of winning has taken on an ever greater importance in NASCAR racing, with teams changing 4 tires, adjusting the suspension, and filling the car with gas, not to mention giving the driver a refreshing drink while cleaning his windshield in less than 20 seconds. The year was 1960, and while Daytona was still the crown prince of racing, the hub of the sport remained in Charlotte, North Carolina. And one of the brashest drivers in the sport, Curtis Turner, hooked up with one of the flamboyant promoters, Bruton Smith, and overcame tremendous odds to build the Charlotte Motor Speedway. When the track was finally done, the pair decided they needed big news to accompany their big new track and announced a 600-mile race, 100 miles longer than the Daytona 500. And they added a big purse, $106,250, with $27,150 going to the winner. Not surprisingly, with a bounty like that, all the big guns came out. Richard and Lee Petty, Gentleman Ned Jarrett, Fireball Roberts, and Junior Johnson. Now the track was so new that the drivers were told, stay out of the infield at all costs to avoid throwing mud and dirt on the track. Another problem was the design of pit road. At the end of pit road was Victory Lane. Well, drivers had problems all day, but none worse than Junior. Always a hard-charging driver, Junior found himself in the infield, trying to make it back on the track. he ended up wiping out victory lane.
Well, you used to go in the infield and you had big caverns out there. I mean, they did a terrific job on that infield now, up till now. But back then, you could run down the hills, you had one high point, everybody headed for it was a pretty high spot over in this infield. And it took lots and lots of years for them to ever get this infield like it is today.
Well, most of the stars of the day ended up cutting through the infield at one point or another and were penalized. By the time the mud had settled and the dirt wiped away, the lean 29-year-old no-name Joe Lee Johnson earned the victory by 4 laps over Johnny Beauchamp. It was a race and a victory that would have impact beyond what took place that day.
It was another major step for the sport of auto racing to get people talking and get them interested in it, because you had another racetrack in Charlotte, North Carolina, which, the first Grand National race that was ever run was run at Charlotte, North Carolina on an old 3/4 mile dirt track. And to bring it back in a major form like this, it was big. And it just gave them something else to talk about and took our sport to one more level.
As the 60s roll along, one driver started notching victories and making a name for himself out of his father's long and storied shadow, Richard Petty. Just saying his name has a certain magic to it for any race car fan. And our next great moment is actually what happened, what Richard did throughout the 1967 season. Because of what was accomplished that year, his name became not only synonymous with racing, but with greatness. What allowed him to be spoken of in the same breath as Roger Maris's 61 home run season and Joe DiMaggio's hitting streak. He defined the ultimate in the sport and transcended it. In a sport where a few wins in a season is considered a success, consider the success Richard enjoyed that year. Of the 49 races held, he won 27, over 50%. One of those victories was at Darlington at the Rebel 400, a memorable victory. It was his 55th career win, put him ahead of his father on the all-time list.
I never started out to set records, never thought about setting records. I just went out and did what I wanted to do and was real fortunate to be able to do what I did. And in the meantime, the records came along. I'd ran until 1967 or something like that, and then somebody come up one day and said, "You're getting close to your daddy's record for 54 wins." I'd never thought about it, and I wasn't shooting for it or nothing. We was just running races, and things were happening. And just like all the races we've run, all we've won, all we've lost, we never set out to do any record situation. We just went out and done our job and done what we enjoyed doing, and the records just happened to come.
That's memorable, a great moment for sure, but not what made the year so amazing. There's the streak. It started with a win at Bowman Gray Stadium on August 12, 1967. 10 races later, the checkered flag dropped as Richard's number 43 crossed the start-finish line first for the 10th consecutive time at North Wilkesboro on October the 1st of that year. 6 of those victories came from the pole during that streak. Most drivers don't get 10 wins in a career. He got 10 in a row, 27 in a season, 27 victories en route to his untouchable record of 200.
1967 was an unbelievable year for any race driver, and Richard Petty to win 10 in a row and 27 overall that year. Now that's when he really came into his own. I mean, he'd won a lot of races before then, but they concentrated, when they built those race cars, they concentrated on building those race cars so they'd be there at the end of the race. I mean, they figured out pretty early, Lee Petty did, in their racing careers, that if you're not there at the end of the race, you aren't going to win. And so the first thing they would try to do is figure out what they needed to do to that race car, how they needed to drive it, so it would be there at the end of the race to give them that chance to win. And that helped them to win a lot of races.
Well, you can have the equipment, and you can have the financial backing. You can have, back then, the factory backing. If you can't drive a race car, you're not going to win. Well, Richard Petty could drive a race car, and you add that to what he had and the number of opportunities he had to win races, 52 races in one season, for example. And sure, it piled up. The numbers piled up. And I don't care if there were 100 races in one season. To win 27 in 1 year. 10 in a row is mind-boggling. I really don't believe that could be done today.
That particular record of 27 wins in 47 races or 46 races, whatever we run, they don't run that many races now. So we have a 30 or a 32 year racing schedule. It's going to be hard to win 27 races in a year. It's going to be hard to win 10 races in a row. In fact, it's hard to finish 10 races in a row. And some of the records and stuff that might be completely out of the realm of possibility because the circumstances now and the system is so much different than what it was when I came through.
Folks, the King is just that, the King. I raced against him, and man, he used to blow my mind. He was so good. Well, along with Big Bill France, you could almost say that Richard made NASCAR what it is today.
Well, certainly winning on the racetrack set the stage for Richard Petty to become the giant that he has become in the sport of auto racing. But if he had not done all the other things that he has done over the years, treated the fans the way that he has treated them, treated the sponsors the way that he has treated them, and looked at the sport and reacted to what he thought was best for the sport over the years, then he would never have become as big as what he has. You know, all the hours that he spent signing autographs, we've heard those stories and talked about them so many times over the years, but you wonder, well, if he was sitting out at a dirt track for an hour or 2 hours or whatever the case might be after a race with several hundred race fans, how much good could that really do the sport? But when he did it for 30 years, then it adds up. And then the way that he always handled himself, Richard Petty didn't ever change. From the time he came into the sport, he was the same smiling type individual regardless of what happened. Along the way, he was still the same. And I think that has meant so much to so many race fans over the years, and I think it's helped to build a lot of new race fans too that say, hey, here is an athlete, a nationally known, internationally known athlete that's still the same old country boy that he was, and people like that.
Richard Petty probably is this sport's consummate all-time professional in all facets of the sport. Sure, there may have been better pure drivers, but there have never been better pure ambassadors to the sport or better people in the sport.
Now, what Richard had done by that date, his career was by no means over. He continued to win, and the sport, following Big Bill's vision, continued to grow. And let me tell you, there are more, many, many more incredible moments in NASCAR history. Check it all out as we follow the road in NASCAR's greatest moments, the modern era. For now, I'm Benny Parsons. Thanks for joining me.